Of all the towering orchestral works from the dawn of the modern era, Gustav Holst's The Planets is one of the most significant in scope, imagination, and influence on our culture. In some ways, in fact, it's perhaps the most significant work to come out of that period. While ground was broken by concert works like Debussy's La Mer, and by ballets like Stravinsky's Firebird and Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe, those edifices of orchestration were tied to highly programmatic narratives. But the 7 movements of the planets don't describe any action for the listener. Rather, they cut straight to the essence of the human condition, describing 7 basic states of influence with shifts of mood, contrasts of emotion, and in some moments, the evolution of consciousness. Instead of processing every passage within the context of a fixed story, the listener is invited to freely associate and find their own meaning. The paradox here is that this highly personal, ambiguous, and yet emotionally direct type of composition has gradually transcended all other approaches in the most contextualized form of music imaginable, the film score. Holst's style has become a trademark for cinematic music, with huge sweeping vistas of sound emphasizing, and quite often overemphasizing, the action of epic motion pictures. The key to this directness, expansiveness, and imaginative breadth rests firmly upon Holst's orchestra, and it is massive. Rather than relying on the doubled or tripled winds of the standard orchestral complement, Holst asks for 4 of each family. 3rd and 4th players not only cover common auxiliaries such as piccolo, English horn, and contrabassoon, but also the rare guest instruments of alto flute and baritone oboe. The result is a wind section with 50 to 100% more power and flexibility, in which each family has a complete quartet of players grounded by a secure bottom end. To this, Holst adds a brass section where nearly every group has got something extra. 2 more horns bolstering the standard quartet, 4 trumpets instead of 2 or 3, and an extra tenor tuba to play octaves with the bass tuba. Along with 3 trombones, this makes a brass section of 15 players, modest by Wagnerian standards, yet more than capable of towering grandeur and slashing intensity. And the list goes on. 2 timpanists sharing 6 kettle drums, 3 percussionists covering 8 instruments, with 2 additional players assigned solely to celesta and xylophone. 2 harpists are called for, and even an organist in places, to solidify some textures to the consistency of marble. And let's not forget the double chorus of wordless female voices. 4 soprano sections and 2 alto sections, interweaving dreamily in the last movement, Neptune the Mystic. Let's do the maths now. Not counting a minimum chorus of 24 voices, all the instruments mentioned so far add up to around 41 players. To balance this huge complement of percussionists, brass and wind players, harpists, and keyboardists, at least double that number of strings is required, a grand total of 80 players, which represents around 10 to 20 extra seats for a standard concert orchestra. The economics here are a bit strange. Of course, few orchestras could afford to hire 150 musicians for every performance, at least in this era of dwindling budgets and lackluster attendance. And yet a concert that features the planets is very likely to sell out. In some ways, its existence helps to perpetuate the programming of the entire genre of mass orchestral repertoire, especially for more modest ensembles. A regional orchestra that successfully organized the resources to perform the planets may decide to tackle a Mahler symphony as a follow-up in the next season, or The Rite of Spring, or even Carmina Burana. As potent and intoxicating as the work may be to the average listener, it's easily double that for a young composer. It's almost a rite of passage to experience a period of intense fascination with the planets, listening to it over and over, marveling at its subtlety of color and hugeness of sound. But once those young composers finally get a look at the full score to the planets, what they'll see will be enormously revealing. This formidable, intricate work actually has the most basic direct architecture possible. It's all as clearly presented as can be, with a minimum of subjectivity or ambiguity. The episodes lock together like pieces of musical Lego, building on each other with firm confidence. To understand why, one has to delve deep into Gustav Holst's approach to craft, which in turn is inextricably linked with his life story, especially for his extraterrestrial opus. In the year 1911, the 37-year-old Holst was a nearly established composer whose works, while not strictly of the pastoralist school, would still sit comfortably on a program next to those of Ralph Vaughan Williams or Percy Grainger. He taught at several girls' schools, most notably St. Paul's, at which he had an artistic residency of sorts. He composed music for theaters, marching bands, and choirs, the working composer's typical fare a century ago. At this point, his musical personality and aesthetic goals are summed up best in the concert work, A Somerset Rhapsody. In it, one can hear a synthesis of many influences, a touch of Elgar in its sense of proportion and virility, a nod to Purcell in its easy lyricism and awareness of English musical heritage. However, there are trademarks that we're later to hear in the planets, like a unique treatment of the merging and contrasting of themes, or an insightful approach to scoring winds with character and individuality. And if you listen closely, you can even hear a touch of Venus the Bringer of Peace in the rising string line following the opening English horn solo. Despite this recognizably English voice as a composer, Holst's interests and influences ranged into many philosophies and cultures. In the previous decade, he'd become fascinated by Sanskrit and set many translated passages of the Rig Veda and Mahabharata as choral works, songs, and even opera. These are all terrifically dramatic and picturesque, composed mostly in a late Romantic style of music. While they lack the rich, distinctive character of Indian music itself, they certainly toy with musical exoticism. On the other hand, Holst resynthesized the music of other cultures in works like Beni Mora, a suite of Arabian-flavored dances for orchestra inspired by a vacation in Algiers. Once again, Holst looks forward to the planets, but in this case, it's in his deft handling of orchestral rhythm and momentum, and the ability to clearly delineate the colors of interacting sections of music. This intriguing music received a mixed reaction at its 1912 premiere. While some listeners and reviewers commended it for its striking beauty, others hissed at the music, and afterwards condemned it for being too unconventional, even too sexy. To quote one starchy critic, "We did not ask for Biskra dancing girls in the Queen's Hall at Langham Place." But in 1912, London audiences were getting more than their money's worth in the innovation department. The Ballet Russe finally brought the full production of Firebird to Covent Garden in June. While there's no clear record of Holst's attendance, he came to know Stravinsky's score very well, and that of its follow-ups, Petrushka and The Rite of Spring, over the next couple of years. More importantly, he absorbed the lesson of this new outlook on orchestral music as a grand, arching spectacle, with enough inherent drama and color not to need any human actors to propel it. Holst had already been headed in this direction, but now he had a measuring stick by which to grade his efforts. A month after the London debut of Firebird, Holst conducted a premiere of his own for the King and Queen, a collection of odd socks called the Fantastes Suite. Each movement was preceded by some absurd quotation by the likes of George MacDonald or Lewis Carroll, which was then illustrated with great whimsy by the orchestra. The reaction was generally positive and amused. No one could deny Holst's command of innovative orchestration techniques, one critic going so far as to dub him the English Stravinsky. But in the face of works like the Firebird, Holst ultimately shelved the work as being unworthy. By September of that same year, Schoenberg's 5 pieces for orchestra hit London like a musical meteorite, leaving a smoking crater in the expectations of those who'd cautiously grown to accept the Firebird. Audience members laughed at the first few bars, and then didn't know what to do with themselves, as the music turned out to demand a high level of intellectual involvement. Some listeners wept as if they had been beaten or violated. Holst found himself intrigued, judging it as like Wagner, but without the tunes. In other words, the emotional impact of a series of sounds could be distilled and then sharpened to a very fine cutting edge, without requiring any traditional thematic context. Meanwhile, the English Stravinsky had a day job to look after, his ongoing post as music teacher at St. Paul's Girls' School. The construction of a new music wing was underway around this time, and Holst took pains that the builders employ the latest techniques in soundproofing the offices and practice rooms. While this innovation doubtless boosted the students' improvement as musicians, it also had a direct effect on Holst's output as a composer. While some composers like Shostakovich might be able to compose in the middle of a train station or a raging hurricane, Holst seems to have required, or at least craved, absolute stillness. Once the new wing was open, he relocated to a house right around the corner from the school, so he could visit his soundproof office at leisure. On Sundays and school holidays, Holst was most likely there, making use of the precious time in this setting of perfect tranquility. The first work he composed was the St. Paul's Suite for string orchestra, an expression of gratitude to the school. Though it doesn't exactly look forward to the planets, there are some touches that show he was toying with elements such as rhythmic ambiguity. The shifting meter of the second movement is particularly interesting, as the restless 4-note ostinato is partnered by both 3/4 and 2/4 episodes. Holst was to employ similar strategies in the planets, especially in the movements Mercury and Uranus. planets, according to Holst, grew in my mind slowly, like a baby in a woman's womb. For more than 2 years, I had the intention of composing that cycle, and during those 2 years it seemed of itself more and more definitely to be taking form. And as we've seen, all the threads were coming together that would enable Holst to proceed in this massive undertaking. His abilities as an orchestrator and unique voice as a composer, his growing reputation under pressure from the achievement of Schoenberg and Stravinsky, a workplace that allowed for uninterrupted creativity, and finally, a strong impulse to realize his fascinations musically. As of the first half of the decade, these fascinations were focused on astrology. With the encouragement of playwright Clifford Bax, the brother of composer Arnold Bax, Holst soon gained the ability to do charts for his friends. It was only natural that this passion should become central to his plans for an extended orchestral composition, as he wrote at the time. As a rule, I only study things which suggest music to me. That's why I worried at Sanskrit. Then recently the character of each planet suggested lots to me, and I have been studying astrology fairly closely. Thus, his Schoenbergian working title of 7 pieces for large orchestra gave way to The Planets. Today we'll examine the conception and orchestration of 4 of these movements: Jupiter, Venus, Saturn, and of course, Mars. The regimented savagery of the first movement, Mars, the Bringer of War, was initiated at the Holst family's quiet weekend cottage in Thaxted in May of 1914, then carried back and forth between there and the soundproof room at St. Paul's. Much has been made over the date of its composition, right at the dawn of World War I, and even more has been made in protest to this, pointing out that the bulk of its composition was completed months before any notion of war lay on the horizon. While it's true that the musical content of Mars cannot be seen as a direct reaction to the war itself, it's also a mistake to completely write off the relationship between the two. The post-Victorian veneer of those times often blinds us to the reality that Europe had been an armed camp for decades, a militarized society of troops, alliances, fortifications, and armaments. It would take an extremely unaware state of mind not to realize that when these enormous forces finally waged war, the devastation would be unprecedented in scope. But there's something even more fundamental to consider here. While most of the notes of Mars were composed before the war, the actual realization of the work as a massive orchestral score was yet to come. Holst originally composed The Planets as a work for 2 pianos, completely playable in its own right, as it still is today. The manuscript was covered with red-inked notations of which orchestral instrument or section he had in mind to score at a later date. But it's not unreasonable to conclude that the scale and horror of World War I may have ultimately pushed Holst's orchestration in the direction of maximal brutality. The bare bones of Mars may have been innocent of the world at war, but its flesh was certainly aware. There are compelling resonances between the piano score and the orchestration that take us back to those years of composition and experimentation. One notable spot occurs about halfway through Mars, when after pages and pages of chordal melodies and masked textures, a single-note solo is allowed to speak its piece. On piano, this covers the rather dull, unremarkable range of the notes around middle C, pounded in with arrogant self-importance. As orchestral music, the meaning becomes clear. The blunt tone of the piano's accented middle register is preserved by the coarse braying of the tenor tuba in its upper register, ironically the first solo instrumental passage in the entire 7-movement suite. It's an eerily perceptive musical illustration of lowbrow calls to war by hawkish statesmen, punctuated by trumpets reacting with all the excitement of soldiers snapping to attention, eager to do their duty. Mars is the most well-known of the 7 movements, and it lays out the basic principles of Holst's approach for the whole suite, with families of instruments playing large chunks of harmony and sections blasting away at octave melodies. It's a very brute force approach to orchestration, nonetheless effective for all that. But as an experienced orchestrator, Holst could also work some clever sleight of hand. One more spot worth mentioning before we move on to other movements is the chilling finale of Mars. For an orchestrational magic trick, listen to the following passage. A series of fluttering gestures mounts in both pitch and excitement in the winds and strings, leading up to the final repeated chords. Right as these 2 passages come together, the winds sweep up to a high chord as the brass starts. To the listener, it sounds like the winds are continuing to play over the brass, but it's an illusion. The overtones of the brass, marked quadruple forte, are actually doing all the work up there, and Holst is merely underlining what he wants the audience to think that it hears with the very last notes of the wind section. But at that dynamic, one couldn't hear the winds anyway, and the strings are only audible because they're digging ferociously into their lowest range. After completing the Mars piano score, Holst moved on directly to composing Venus the Bringer of Peace and Jupiter the Bringer of Jollity. Their optimism was in direct contradiction to the grim news coming back to England by late 1914, and the starkest contrast possible to the first movement. Where Mars absolutely fills a room with monstrous insistence, Venus lets the room fill itself, and uses the silence as a canvas over which to make calm but potent gestures. In that silence, one can hear infinite subtleties, even when Holst masses combined sections. The tone is set right at the start, with a lonely horn solo leading off, joined by 4 flutes descending and 3 oboes ascending, merging together seamlessly. This trick is repeated immediately, but with clarinets partnering the flutes. Listen very closely to the radiance of these 2 phrases. Once again, it's all in the overtones, glowing high above the actual pitches. In a live concert hall with great acoustics, the effect is magical. The treatment of the string section is another one of Venus's outstanding features. In Mars, the strings are used to initiate or underline the insistent 5/4 rhythm, or to stabilize massed textures. They rarely speak as a section for their own sake. In Venus, the tables are turned. The heavy brass are completely absent. The strings dominate, and the winds and horns often support them, adding harmonic emphasis to the fulfillment of melodic gestures, or pulsing in offbeat accompaniment. Jupiter, the bringer of jollity, was next to be completed. And it's interesting to note here that Holst composed the movements of the planets in an order in which huge maximalist scoring was alternated by more coloristic, subtle endeavors. The monstrous machinery of Mars was followed by the generous calm of Venus. The boisterous bantering of Jupiter gave way to the sinister decay of Saturn. The brash, over-the-top jesting of Uranus was relieved by the otherworldly mysteries of Neptune. Last of all, the supple virtuosity of Mercury was inserted between Venus and Jupiter. So in essence, the planets as a suite was composed in the order in which it's performed, with the exception of the latecomer Mercury. When we listen to it, we're following Holst through his own creative journey, experiencing his inspirations as they came to him. The score of Jupiter returns to Holst's pastoralist tendencies, merged seamlessly with the motion and momentum of Stravinsky, then cast once again in a titanic scope. In some respects, it's a study in energy and tempo, using thematic arcs to guide the listener's expectations through all the fluctuations of speed and timing. But that's not to say that this experiment is elevated in any way by the orchestration. Rather, without the voluminous forces brought to bear, the experiment would fail. Beneath all its apparent excesses, Jupiter's architecture is actually cleanly and carefully conceived. One missing element could cause the whole thing to come crashing down, or simply sound absurd. Despite the imaginative flurries of strings and winds, not to mention all the trumpet fanfares, the real stars of Jupiter are the six-member horn section. They're everywhere, stating most of the main themes, underpinning the orchestra with counter-melodies and syncopation, and generally serving as the glue that holds the movement together. The following section contains a little bit of everything for the horns, starting with a blasting six-voice unison melody as the strings slam the downbeat in double and triple stops. Then as the strings and winds take over the melody, the horns counterpoint with upbeat chords and downward bulging arpeggios. Listen for those elements, and for the little call and response game that the horns play with the sizzling tambourine. The two-piano score for Jupiter is a perplexing bit of repertoire. Long stretches of oompa bass and chords, with plain single-note melodies, passages of angelic, almost cloying chords, ideas spilling out until they're nearly impossible to contain within the span of 20 fingers, and arcs of breathtaking pianism on a virtuosic level. Here's an example of how much orchestration had to be added to what's notated in these four staves, especially towards the end. The resonance of pedaled piano arpeggios contains within it a harmonic texture of its own. Listen to the piano version of the wind-up before the coda, how the pedal creates a wash of color. Now compare that to the orchestral version. Once again, our heroes, the horns, come to the rescue, recreating that wash with a hovering background chord, embedding the hanging, omnipresent tones that fly by in the wind's harp and strings. One caution that most orchestration teachers drill into their students is to not waste the harpist's time, especially by scoring a passage in which they can't be heard. Holst breaks this rule only once, for a quite interesting reason. At the start of the hymn-like section of Jupiter, the strings and horns intone the solemn melody, while the two harps and lower winds play processional chords in support. The harps can barely be heard, but they add a bit of bite and thrum to the attack of each chord. As the music opens up, though, and more instruments join in at louder levels, the harps disappear into the texture completely. While sometimes parts like this are justifiable because of tone weight, in this case it wouldn't make any difference if the harpists were playing or not. So why does master orchestrator Gustav Holst allow the harp part to continue? For the benefit of the harpists. It really is a lovely, uplifting bit of scoring, completely idiomatic and playable on harp. So why not leave it in, and give the harpists the best seats in the house for a few bars? This passage of Jupiter is Holst at his most populist. One brief section of melody made him a star with the public. Holst eventually set the tune to the patriotic poem, I Vow to Thee, My Country, and it was also borrowed for church hymns and the like. But this cultural hook became a bit of an embarrassment for Holst in later years, especially when it was mistaken to express politically conservative sentimentality. Another worry was the request by concert programmers to put Jupiter at the end of the set, in order to finish the concert on an overwhelmingly positive note. It led the composer to observe that they wanted the music, like life itself, to somehow end gloriously, while the truth was quite different in both cases. And what was that truth? Holst answered that question with the chilling, ominous movement Saturn, the bringer of old age. This was always his favorite of the suite, and it's easy to see why in the context of his approach leading up to the planets. There's a far-reaching extension of free lyricism across carefully woven yet ambiguous textures, the germ of which was so present in A Somerset Rhapsody. The exoticism of Benny Mora is twisted by the filter of Schoenberg into a shifting depiction of the gradual draining of color and life from the world. But most importantly, here's where Holst's mastery of orchestration shines brightest. Every passage is unique, lovely, and entirely original. Venus may be enchanting, Mars and Jupiter merely huge, but Saturn is eternal. The whole movement seems to tick like a clock, alternating chords as if counting the precious seconds left before night falls. The opening of Saturn is brilliant in its simplicity. Harp harmonics, double flutes and alto flutes played in their lowest register. And then from the darkest depths comes a devastating statement from the double bass section. Listen for how the other instruments trade off this simple motive. First, the upper strings, then oboe melting into cellos, and finally that rarest of rare occurrences, a baritone oboe solo. That's not to suggest that Saturn is all solos. There are some superbly scored tutti passages, like the processional episode in the middle of the movement. This reaches a climax as the brass are pushed ever higher and louder, up to the trumpet's top C, with a sound that's as crisp as a cracker. The mass orchestra cuts in suddenly with a wild reiteration of the opening flute chords, fronted by the clanging of tubular bells. These two musical ideas fight for dominance, but the bigger idea takes control in the end, and as it does, the heavy brass and bass instruments of the orchestra become the leading voices. The pages of score here are as dotted as a swarm of bees, but the actual content is quite spare, typical of Holst's maximum payback for minimal effort. Saturn ends with passages of incredible delicacy, with glittering harps and gently murmuring horns behind the strings as they muse one last time over the opening motive. An awesome but almost inaudible cosmic joke floats over the top of the score. The flutes, reprising a thematic arc from Jupiter, arpeggios cascading downward with a quick lift back up, and then acceptance. Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune took all of the year 1915 to compose, followed by Mercury in early 1916. But the work was far from over. Each movement had to be scored orchestrally, transcribing Holst's tiny red-inked reminders to himself onto large sheets of staff paper. When his arm gave out due to his lifelong struggle with neuritis, the busy work of scoring was turned over to his trusted assistants, whom he affectionately called "my three right arms." These extra arms belonged to his star pupil, the composer Jane Joseph, and those of fellow St. Paul's teachers Nora Day and Valley Lasker. The latter two had played the two-piano score many times for Holst, helping him to grasp the scope of his own monumental undertaking. Now these scribes received detailed instructions for each episode: which instrument should play what line of music, what section of instruments would cover which chords, and so on. Holst supplied sheets of staff paper, ready formatted for the orchestral forces needed on each specific page. There's something prescient about this way of working, as many film composers today use similar methods. They compose the music and dictate the instruments to be used, then leave the hard work of notating the orchestral score to a staff of assistants. But it's highly significant that Holst's pianists should help transcribe the final score of the planets. Chordal passages and groups of winds and brass seem to fit under a pianist's hands, taken right out of the scratch score and expanded across a series of staves. And yet it succeeds as very natural-sounding orchestration, where many other orchestrated piano scores sound clunky and claustrophobic. Holst never again scored another purely orchestral work of such scale or length. Having pulled together all of his energy, influences, and potential for greatness into one mighty effort, he found at the end the work didn't represent his own idea of who he really was as a composer. For the rest of his career, audiences waited expectantly for another grandiose orchestral work, and were baffled by the modest, ironic, or generally low-key works that followed. And the longer they waited, the more the composer of the Planets came to resent his signature work for undercutting the appreciation of every other work in his sizable canon. The greater loss was really the public's, as Holst's post-Planets work is arguably some of the best of 20th century English contemporary music. It had a great influence on older colleagues like Vaughan Williams, and younger ones like Britten and Tippett. No matter how much these later works show an evolution away from the Planets, though, the marks of discipline and craftsmanship are the same, and the immense intellectual and emotional growth of that period is reflected clearly. Let's finish with a bit of Holst's 1927 composition, Egdon Heath, which he considered his best work. As you'll hear if you're a cinema buff, The Planets isn't Holst's only work to have been appropriated by the great film composers of the past 60 years.